Hey folks, thank you for understanding about that phone call a minute ago. It might happen again, but hopefully I'll be able to get the rest of this lecture ready and out for you before that happens. So sorry, and sorry for not knowing how to splice all of that stuff together. Anyway, we were in the middle of our agriculture talk, a little bit of agriculture that we're touching on right now, because it's important that you understand like the background that this guy Thomas Malthus was coming from when he made his predictions about population and demographics, because it had to do with food supply and a population boom. So I think I was telling you in the end of the last video that agriculture before the Industrial Revolution, you needed a whole lot of people to make it work right. You had big families because the more people you had, the more workers you had to produce food. Agriculture also brought about some of the kinds of things that we still deal with today and often think of as social problems, like social inequality having to do with land ownership or control. These days, ownership and control of wealth and power. Back then, wealth and power came with land ownership. And land ownership, for the very first time in this subsistence strategy, was a big deal. The other subsistence strategies that I talked to you about didn't have land ownership. They had communal areas that were generally understood to be accessible by anybody and everybody in the community who needed them, really tiny populations in comparison to the boom that you see in agriculture. The surplus enabled the boom to happen. The need for workers also kind of propelled the boom forward. So Thomas Malthus lived during the Industrial Revolution when those plows were being created, which meant that now we didn't need 80 people to tend the acre. We could have two with an ox and a plow, and it would do the same work as those 80 people. So Thomas Malthus saw a time when, he lived in a time when agriculture was producing a pretty consistent amount of food. He said that agriculture, or that our food supply, was reproduced in a linear fashion. So our food supply was pretty much constant, but people's population was, or the population rate, so here's the birth rate, he said, was increasing. This would be an exponential increase in the birth rate, whereas this was the food supply. The food supply was staying constant, but the birth rate was increasing, and so the number of people in the population was going up, but he predicted dire circumstances as a result of this, because he said there's not going to be enough food to keep these people alive. So there's going to be terrible poverty, there's going to be terrible strife, there's going to be all kinds of terrible calamities for society in general if population is not held in check. It's funny, not funny in a ha-ha way, but funny in a spooky and kind of sinister way, really. If you go back to Thomas Malthus's writing in, the middle of the Industrial Revolution, he actually, I'm not going to be able to quote him, but I'll paraphrase. He actually wrote several different essays and passages in longer works about how a pandemic, it would be extremely useful for controlling the population. In other words, what we're dealing with right now with, the threat of so many lives lost in the coronavirus crisis, he actually, from his bird's eye view of the situation, said that pandemics such as the plague, such as cholera that some of you researched in an earlier week during the semester, that those were beneficial things for society, because he said that the food supply only was reproduced and available in a linear fashion. It was constant. Because even though that plow made the work easier, it didn't make the surplus or the production increase. That came later, where you saw like huge booms of being able to produce and produce and produce way in excess of what we needed. So anyway, many economists and demographers today say that he was wrong on so many different levels, but his work also goes into so many different evil villain kind of characters who want to reduce the population to save on resources and stuff like this in an environment. So his focus was on the food supply and the birth rate, and suggested, he didn't only say a good pandemic every once in a while would keep that population down, but he also suggested some birth control methods. And when I say birth control to you, it's been about 100 years since the pill was instituted, or since Sanger, kind of advocated for birth control methods for women. But at this time, the only birth control method was abstinence. And so he actually called for some things that sound great, like education and careers for women. He called for that. So for the purpose of occupying women during their early childbearing years with something that was non-reproductive in nature, so that we would spend more of our childbearing years improving our education, working for the general good, and getting, income of our own before we married later. So he advocated celibacy or abstinence and marrying later in order for that woman not to have as many babies as she could in her reproductive lifetime. So there are some great suggestions. Some of you might criticize his work in a positive way and say that there are some great suggestions among the things that he talks about as far as population control, but he was definitely wrong on a great many levels because he didn't have all the information that the future held, right? He did not have information about how those leaps and bounds forward in industrialized agriculture, how that would bring our food supply to not only, so this is a linear display of food production, this is an exponential increase in birth, but we've got, like, can I say, a logarithmic kind of food supply available now. So we can support all kinds of folks in the population. Yet we still have poverty worldwide, or just in our own, at our own back door. So anyway, this is an interesting first world problem that we're going to talk about. First world, second world, and third world problem that we will talk about as the semester moves on. So Thomas Malthus, read about him in chapter 2, search, do a Google search and read about him. There's some good videos on YouTube where you can learn more about his ideas of population control and what the food population relationship was and how it was going to cause trouble in society. This is still the foundational, it's a couple hundred years old now. His work is still the foundational idea that we look at in cultural geography and other fields. And there are people who have updated his ideas that focused just on food and population, and we call them NeoMalthusians. Or Malthusians, sorry, NeoMalthusians. There's my dog barking at, I think my husband slammed the door downstairs, and so my dog Gunny has to go a little berserk. But anyway, so NeoMalthusians are modern day theorists, people who are alive today, who look to Thomas Malthus's work and they say, okay, there's some flaws here, but if you update it, and instead of just looking at food, you look at resources in general, like rare earth resources or fossil fuels that are finite, that human beings are using up. And so what are we going to do when fossil fuels run out? If we have all this industry, all of this, all these mechanized devices that, rely on it, if it's a finite supply, finite means limited, or ask Siri for a longer definition. If it's a finite supply, then what happens when we run out, right? And also, NeoMalthusians would talk about climate change as a result of overuse of fossil fuels and stuff like that. So it's about, in modern days, it's about population and also the way that huge population is using the natural resources that the earth provides, and how many of them are finite, and what's going to happen, right? When we use it all up, what's going to happen to population. So even though he is really to you, maybe sounds like ancient history in demographics and economics. He's got a lot of valid points. At least he's got some points that NeoMalthusians use today to talk about the relationship, the human-environment interaction between population in general and the resources that are on Earth. So I hope I didn't talk too fast. Of course, you can slow it down or speed it up or pause it or any of those kinds of things that you need to. But at least we made it through without another phone call. So the next time we do a video, it's going to be with the demographic transition model in the background, and just my voice, I think, is all I'm going to be able to do, because the webcam, I can't get the webcam to work on this computer that I'm using at the moment. Not with me in the background. Anyway, you get the picture. So thank you for putting up with these remote learning days, and text me as usual, text me with questions. See you soon.